Hi everyone, and apologies for the 1 minute delay. We normally take a minute before we start. So welcome to this the CCAOI Manthan, which is to actually discuss the AI governance guidelines, which have recently been out for public comments. My name is Amrita Chaudhary, and I would be the moderator for today's discussion. As we mentioned,
Hi everyone, and
sorry.
apologies for the 1 minute delay. We normally take a minute before.
Sorry, there was the noise which was going on. So just a brief before we start about CCAOI. We are a trust and we are engaged in capacity building, research and advocacy, mostly in India related to internet governance and digital policies, but we do some global work also. We represent the interest of different stakeholders in the country, including connected and unconnected users. And for nearly 2 decades, we have been organizing capacity building initiatives, webinars, conferences, events, and conducting research on issues related to internet governance, digital policy, telecom, etc. And this discussion, as I said, is related to the report on AI governance guidelines and developments. Like any technology, AI has immense opportunities, especially for a country like India. However, there are concerns about the harms it can cause, which cannot be overlooked. And therefore, the discussion on AI governance is very important and is gaining traction. So this discussion is primarily to facilitate, easy understanding of the various provisions of the guidelines, and also to have more discussion and have thoughts from various stakeholders, experts on what should India's AI governance framework look like. And we also want you to encourage you to make your submissions. And as an outcome of this discussion, a report would be prepared with the key takeaways and suggestions and circulated along with our submission. So we have a distinguished panel of speakers who would be providing their perspective on this topic. And after that, you could share your views. And we want it to be as interactive as possible. So, if you have any questions, you could prefix question and share it in the chat. If it's a comment, you could always mention it as comment and place it in the chat. And during the open house section, you can raise your hand and ask your question or share your comment. You can raise your hand and speak up. And in case you put your question in the chat, if the experts feel, they can always respond to it over the chat too. While speaking, do remember to mention your name and affiliation. And while we encourage active participation and diverse views in the session, but we would request you to be mindful and courteous to each differing view. No abusive language, personal attacks will be tolerated. And if you're not speaking, do keep your mic muted. In terms of agenda, Swati is our online moderator. She would be posting the agenda in the chat. Shraddhanjali Sharma from our team would be presenting a brief overview of the draft guidelines. Then we have the panel discussion where we have our esteemed speakers, Tarunima Prabhakar, who is from Tattle, Urvashi Aneja, who's from Digital Future Lab, Vivan, Saran, who is from Koan Advisory Group, but he also is representing the AI Knowledge Consortium. We have Kazim Rizvi from the Dialogue, who is also representing Core AI, and Amlan Mohanty, who is an independent tech policy advisor. And then we would be having our open discussion. Since we have a tight schedule, we would request Shraddhanjali and all our speakers to keep to the time. And with that, Shraddhanjali, over to you for a brief overview.
Thank you, Amrita. I won't take much time. I'll just take 5 minutes to just give a brief overview of the report. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Shraddhanjali, and I'll just spend 5 minutes giving a brief overview of what has been highlighted. These are only the highlights from the report, and I think we'll be discussing it in details later. So, as we know, MeitY, they constituted this subcommittee on AI governance and guidelines back in 2023, and they have released this report on AI governance guideline development, and this has been released for public comments. So the entire intent behind releasing this document or the report was to, have certain principles, certain guidelines for responsible and ethical AI adoption, and also to understand what can be done in terms of, having a proper governance system, what are the gaps, what are the challenges, and what can be done. So on the key governance principles that has been laid down in the document, and I think these are guidelines that are also there in OECD, and we have seen this governance principles, AI governance principles, in most of the AI related documents. So I'll go through it one by one. First is the transparency, that the report has stated that AI system should provide meaningful information regarding the development, the processes, the impact, the processes, and the capabilities. Accountability, in terms of accountability, they have stated that the developers as well as the deployers, they should take full responsibility of the functioning as well as the outcome of the AI system. Then third is the safety and the robustness, that the AI system which is deployed or are developed, they should be safe and reliable and also should be robust. Privacy and security in terms of compliance with the data protection laws, fairness and non-discrimination to prevent the AI biases, and human oversight, to have human, AI system should be subjected to human oversight. Then there's another principle, that is the inclusive and sustainable AI, that is whatever benefits are there from the innovation, that is having an equitable distribution of the innovation in terms of AI benefits. Then the digital first governance, where they have talked about how we can leverage the technology in order to use it for effective compliance and regulation, mostly in terms of the techno-legal measures. Then for operationalizing the principles, there are three key points that has been highlighted in the report. The first thing that has been highlighted is to understand the life cycle of the entire AI system, as in how it is designed, how it is put into use, and how the end user uses it. So having a knowledge of the entire life cycle of the AI system, that would be important in order to understand what governance system should we have, or how do we mitigate the risk. So this is one of the key point that has been highlighted in the report in order to operationalize the 6 principles that are already there. Then the second is the ecosystem view of the AI actors. So what the report has stated is that we understand actors in the ecosystem mostly in isolation, but understanding the entire ecosystem in terms of the different actors that play a key role in the AI ecosystem, that would be important in order to understand what will be their roles, their responsibility, and how will we make them liable in terms of giving roles and responsibilities and liabilities. Third is leveraging the technology for governance. So we already have legal frameworks in place, we have the compliance mechanisms in place, but they have written that having technology, technological tools, integrating technological tools into the AI system in order to have this effective compliance mechanism, this is something that will be required in order to operationalize the principles. Then some of the key challenges and gaps that has been identified in the report is first is regarding deepfakes and misinformation. So in the report, it has been analyzed that we already have laws, we already have a legal structure in place in order to deal with it in terms of the IT Act, in terms of IPC, the intermediary guidelines. But what they have stated is that we need to have the integration of technology in order to make the compliance system more effective. So what they have suggested is having some identical, having the concept of watermarking, the watermarking of input and the output, so that you understand how to trace the deepfakes. Then in terms of cybersecurity risk, they have introduced the concept of secure by design. Introduced in the sense that what they have said is for cybersecurity, we already have cybersecurity laws in place, but what we need today is secure by design. Just like for privacy legislation, we have privacy by design. For cybersecurity framework, we need secure by design. Regarding IP, they have raised certain questions. So the first question that they have raised is regarding the use of copyrighted material for training the data sets, for training the AI models in terms of the data set. So how do you go and ask consent from every author whose copyrighted material that you are using? That is one of the questions that has been raised in the report. The other question that has been raised in the report is regarding the final output that is being produced by AI system. So to what extent human control is required in order to consider the output that is being produced by the AI model as a copyrightable material, and also whether we consider it to be a computer generated output and whether it should be copyrighted. So those questions has been raised regarding IP. Then the other fourth issue that has been analyzed is regarding the AI biases and discrimination, like having proper system where there is less biases and transparency and responsibility in terms of understanding the entire life cycle. Because of the black box nature, it's difficult to understand how to go on tracing the entire, the life cycle of the AI. Then the third and the last one is fragmented regulatory oversight. So there has been a key point that has been highlighted in terms of having multiple agencies and multiple sectoral regulations in terms of having a compliance system in place, but then everyone is working in isolation. So what they have suggested is having a more coherent approach or whole of government approach towards AI governance. So I'll conclude it with the guidelines that has been proposed. So I think we'll be discussing this in detail. So I'll just highlight it. The first is establishment of an interministerial AI governance group. So this is for understanding the coordination across the department, because they have suggested that we have more coherence among the departments. Then the second is setting up a technical secretariat who can provide the technical support. Third is having an AI database to track the AI risk. Fourth is having a concept of self-regulation where the industries and the stakeholders in ecosystems, they are voluntarily reporting. Then the other is the second last is adopting a technological solution. So basically integrating technology into AI system. That is the techno-legal measures that they have spoken in the previous part of the report. And the last that they have suggested is having an integration of the AI governance in the Digital India Act. So I think with this, I'll stop sharing, and I think I'll hand it over to Amrita to start the discussion.
Thanks so much, Shraddhanjali, for this, a very high-level update on what the salient features of the report, the guidelines are. With this, I think I will move to the panelists here. My question to each one of you would be, I could go with Tarunima first, then Urvashi, possibly go to... whom do I see in my screen? Kazim, Vivan, and then Amlan. And my question to you would be, you've been working on AI and AI governance for a long time, and you've been looking at this report too. Your initial take on this report, the concerns you see, perhaps in 5 to 6 minutes, if you could restrict your initial responses. Tarunima, would you like
Sure.
to?
Yeah, I can start. Great. So thank you for the invitation. It also became an opportunity for me to really drill into the subcommittee report and maybe articulate some of my thoughts more clearly as well. I think to start off, I would say that actually, as far as, and I think Shraddhanjali mentioned that the principles are not very unique. These are principles that we have seen in other reports as well. And I actually thought there were a lot of things in the report that were salient and in some ways caught some of the complexity and nuance of where AI development is at the time. Because currently, when we talk about AI, we're talking about some of the more traditional predictive technologies, and then we're talking about generative AI, which is very large scale, very compute intensive, and then to have an overarching guideline that covers all of these different sort of scales of application. I mean, I'm not surprised that the report has so many future steps, right? In the sense, it's in some ways establishing mechanisms to figure out the answers to some of the questions. It's not really answering the questions, and I think it's too early to get there. I think I definitely felt that the position that the report has taken on misinformation, disinformation, aligns with some of our views as well, which is that there are existing laws that are sufficient to address concerns around misinformation, disinformation. We don't need more regulatory regimes specifically to look at synthetic media or misinformation spread through synthetic media. And I think on the point of watermarking, it is something that a lot of people have been trying to implement technically. Uh, m- my my sort of belief is that given where generative AI is, we are going to be awash. We already are awash in content, and it will just continue to grow. So we'll just be swimming in content for the next few years. And in such a world, to think that watermarking of what is incorrect or what is synthetic or AI generated is going to, you're going to have to label a lot of content. And I think we might get to the world where begin to watermark what is authentic. So I think the analogy for me is that, when you get to a point where people can replicate paintings, you have Mona Lisa by the numbers. We're not going to try and mark every fake Mona Lisa and say, or like every copy of Mona Lisa imitation and say, this is an imitation. What we want is the original one, right? So I think my view on watermarking is just that, yeah, maybe it's also interesting to flip the way we look at watermarking. But regardless, the broader point is that there are technical mechanisms that, or we need to have some technical tools and artifacts to get some of this governance in place. And that overarching sort of concept, I do agree with. I think there is also, and this is something that's become clearer in the way the UK has rechristened the its AI Safety Institute to AI Security Institute, right? Is that the report, for example, has talks about bias and or basically says fairness and non-discrimination, and then it has this concern of cybersecurity. But I think between bias and discrimination and say cybersecurity, there are safety risks. So for example, when AI is being used to generate malicious code, I'm not sure whether that categorizes as cybersecurity, because it's not as if the model itself is vulnerable. And I also don't think it doesn't qualify as unfairness or bias, right? So I think there are a whole range of concerns around generative AI systems in particular that I could not figure out where to place those concerns in the current framework. And again, while the overarching mechanism might work to discover and address some of those risks, I think some of those risks need to be explicitly called out in the report, right? So when AI systems, for example, enable self-harm, which is what we saw with this character.ai bot, where someone believed that they were talking to a real person, and then eventually, thought this person was a girlfriend or whatever, and then eventually, it contributed to them killing themselves. I think some of those concerns are not getting captured in this framework. Maybe in inclusivity, but I feel like it's a very tame word to talk about safety risks. So yeah, I think that is something that I would have liked to see a lot more of. And I think also in terms of coming back to my original point of like scales of applications, um, I mean, India has generally said that, sectoral approach makes sense, but because we are in the age of foundational models, and, these are models that are then being fine tuned to generate, or basically fine tuned for a lot of different applications. Maybe explicitly calling out what needs to be done for those foundational models, for governance of those foundational models, would have also been useful. Again, I think I can read into the specifics. I mean, I can read into some of the text and say that, okay, I see how this could apply. But yeah, I think making some of it more specific, which is that, because these are not sector specific applications, what does risk management for these models look like? And again, this is an open research field everywhere, it's not just in India. And so when there are conversations about capabilities of model, which is that, are models capable of detecting certain content? But then there is also stuff that happens in the human AI interaction. There are a couple of risks that emerge in human AI interaction. So I think having some conversation of both, how do you assess the capabilities of foundational models as well as human AI interaction? I think that would have also made this quite strong. But on the whole, again, I would say that there was enough text and enough structure there that I could find. If I really looked, I could see how some of the things I want are covered. But again, it's like maybe someone else will not see those things. So yeah, I'll pause with that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Tarunima, for sharing, the overview and how you look at it. Like at a higher level, everything's there, but the devil lies in the details. I guess that's the detailing is not there. And I think everyone's trying to grapple and understand how these models even work. With that, perhaps I'll go to Urvashi. Urvashi, over to you.
Thanks, Amrita, and thanks for having me here. Similar to Tarunima, it gave me a chance to actually go into the guidelines and read them a little bit closely. So thanks for that as well. I mean, I think there was, and I'm echoing some of what Tarunima said here. I think there were a number of things in the document that was actually very good to see. Right. I think even just saying upfront that the role of kind of governance is around reduction of risks and harms, and that harm mitigation should be a core kind of regulatory principle. I think that was a welcome addition, where a lot of sometimes the governance frameworks have been both around kind of enabling access as well as mitigating risks and trying to kind of balance opportunities and risks. So in that sense, stating quite clearly that harm mitigation is a core regulatory principle, I think was a very welcome was very welcome in the guidelines, as well as the points around the need for a whole of government approach, the also the perspective of kind of taking a life cycle approach and thinking that harms can occur all the way from the design, development, deployment, diffusion across these various stages of the AI life cycle. And I thought, and in addition to that, I thought was also what I was also happy to see was this focus, this realization that we do have existing tools in our kind of regulatory toolkit, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel and come up with brand new things, right? So, and that in many cases, it's about kind of strengthening existing frameworks, strengthening existing regulatory tools, and perhaps working on the implementation of those. So I think all of those were, really positive things in the guidelines. On the last point on the kind of existing frameworks and how they could be strengthened, it did kind of strike me that there were two aspects that from the existing kind of regulatory toolkit that didn't get enough kind of real estate in this document. And one was around data protection and whether the existing data protection regulations are going to be adequate or not, and where the gaps might be. And I think that's something that we will the various committees will take up later. But also around competition, right? It did strike me that there was very little mention, almost no mention, also around the role of kind of competition law in addressing some of the harms of AI systems. Again, similar to, then maybe moving on to kind of like what I thought was missing in the framework. And there, again, similar to Tarunima, I thought that the framing of harms was in some sense a little bit restrictive. There's a wider set of harms that I think we need to be concerned about. I always find it amusing that deep fakes preoccupy so much of regulatory attention. Another number one concern around AI harms. But from where I sit, I would not put them as a number one kind of concern. But of course, they're important. But there's a number of other issues that I think that also we need to be addressed as well. And similarly, like, you were saying, like the devil is in the detail. I think what this document talks about is really the new institutional mechanisms that are going to be in place, but how those mechanisms are actually going to address some of these complex issues. I think we have a lot of work that needs to be done there. And, if we compare it, for an example, with the EU AI Act or some of the other regulatory regimes that are emerging around the world, what is really missing here is the how, right? Is it going to be through a risk classification framework? How are we going to be classifying those risks? Is there going to be something to evaluate model capabilities? Is there going to be something for ongoing kind of monitoring and evaluation? So I think it would have been good to have some more kind of detail on what some of those concrete kind of frameworks might be through which at least anchor these new institutional structures. And in line with that, it also struck me that the language of rights was pretty much missing across the whole document. I think constitutional rights is mentioned once across the document, and everything else is in terms of user rights or consumer rights. So I do think that we need to anchor these processes, this new institutional mechanism, very clearly in a set of rights as well, which are embedded in the Constitution. Some of those rights are, of course, mentioned in other frameworks that the government has put out. So it could have been just that we don't want to repeat those, but just that we shouldn't lose sight of what that kind of value framework is. And equally, And I think, in terms of even the institutional structures, whether it's the technical secretariat or the whole of government approach, I do think that what we need to emphasize across both of these kind of bodies is the importance of this being a multi-stakeholder approach, it not being kind of prone to private capture, which is what we see with a lot of institutional bodies currently who are advising the government, that there is an outsized influence of private sector players and very little on civil society actors. Even the academic folks who do contribute to discussions on AI governance are the same few set of players. We don't really have a wide set of actors inputting into these. So, things like the technical secretariat, etc., I think are really, really welcome. But we need to think about the composition of that body and how we ensure its governance. Maybe I'll just end with something that was a concern to me, and is something that I think gets spoken about quite loosely in the Indian context also. There was a kind of new principle that has snuck into our articulation of these principles, right? Which is the digital by design principle. You don't actually see in the traditional canon of responsible AI principles, but you do see it a lot in India, this idea of a techno-legal approach. And I do think we have to, before we let it become like our standard response on which we hang all our answers, for governance, we need to take a slightly more critical look at what a techno-legal approach means and what its limitations might be. Essentially, in some sense, techno-legal are useful, but they also still need democratic oversight and debate, right? And in some sense, they suffer from a legitimacy deficit. I think we have to think of regulation as a social practice, not just as a design practice that can be left to kind of software engineers. Because what that then also means is that we're delegating rulemaking to code, to software engineers, and those interpretations can become entrenched in digital systems. And in some cases, this can be very straightforward, right? But in many cases, not everything can be expressed in terms of a kind of binary language of software. And the underlying assumption of a kind of techno-legal approach is that it is the design of the technology that is the problem. And so it can be designed in a way that reduces harm. But what that kind of diverts attention from essentially is that the appropriateness of that technology is not something that is then discussed. The minute you start talking about techno-legal approach, we're just talking about how to make it better. And a techno-legal approach also takes away this question of the structural impacts of introducing those systems. Those are not covered in something that you can just design better. So to give you a simple example, something like an automated facial recognition system or use of automated facial recognition systems in public spaces, even with perfect privacy and data security measures in place, so privacy by design, security by design, it can still contribute to a chilling effect on democracy, right? So there's a structural question, there's a structural harm that you cannot address through a techno-legal approach. Another example would be kind of social media platforms. So even if you anonymize data perfectly, or you protect kind of people's data by design. If you think about social media and children's mental health or something like that, the technology is not the problem. There's a larger ecological context that creates that problem. So, I think we just need to be and this is obviously a longer discussion, but just to say that I think we need to be slightly wary of hanging all our kind of governance tools on a techno-legal approach and recognize much more clearly where we can use a techno-legal approach and where we cannot use a techno-legal approach. And then just finally, I think there's a lot of emphasis on kind of voluntary commitments in the document. And again, we know that voluntary commitments don't necessarily work all the time. So I think we need some kind of stratification framework on where we want voluntary commitments and where we need more binding commitments as well. And so that goes back to the question of really thinking about what these committees are going to do and what is the approach that they're going to take. So yeah, I'll stop there, and then of course happy to come back later again.
Right. Thanks, Urvashi. Thanks for the comments. In fact, to complement it, I think Archit had posted something in the chat, and there have been comments in the chat by Vignesh, by Arindam, and Archit. You could look at it later. There are some questions also. And with that, I would be moving on to Kazim, if I'm not mistaken. So Kazim, over to you. How do you look at it? And I know you are concerned, you have some comments on the copyright aspect of it also, but over to you.
Thanks, Amrita. I hope I'm audible. Perfect. So I think, and I won't repeat what my fellow panelists have said, but I broadly agree with them. I think the report does a good job of collecting and bringing all the issues together, from governance principles, which of course are borrowed from OECD, to the ecosystem view of the AI actors, the whole life cycle approach. So it does a good job of putting these ideas together. Um, Obviously, deepfakes finds a mentioning. There is copyright, there is competition, there is a little bit of a mention on safe harbor as well at the end of the report, antitrust issues, etc. So I think it sort of tries to bring in all the key areas, all the key conversation points which are taking place when it comes to AI governance broadly. And I think it poses more question than answers, because I also feel that there are a lot of questions which are open-ended, points which are open-ended, which require further deliberation. I think one of the things which stood out for me, and this is an area where we've been working in the last couple of months, is on copyright. Obviously, there are 2 points to this, right? One is at the data input stage, and one is at the output stage. And I believe that the assumptions made in the report are flawed with respect to how the Indian copyright law actually works. And I think that's where I believe that there is a lot more to do in terms of the research. It leaves some gaps. The report assumes that a model trained on copyrighted data is potentially infringing. And I think that's something which is a little challenging, because the Indian copyright law, and as per the law itself, there are a few things which are of importance. Number one, reproduction rights. And if we talk about reproduction, if you are reproducing content as per what it was originally developed and you're distributing it as it was supposed to be, the purpose for which it was developed, in those cases, there is an infringement. But what happens when a Gen AI model trains data? Of course, for the purpose of training, you have to make copies of data sets. You have to reproduce technically. But under the copyright law, it's arguably, you can say that those activities may not lead to a copyright infringement when it comes to reproduction. Similarly, when it comes to copying or storage, the Indian copyright law is actually very clear that it has to be for the purpose of distribution. It has to be for the purpose of exploitation, access to humans at large. That does not take place. The output which is generated from the Gen AI models is not verbatim, or in cases where it is, there is an infringement, but it's not the original content which goes out. I think the whole point of idea expression dichotomy was missed. There was an opportunity in the report to bring that up. There was an opportunity to talk about the RG Anand case as well, where it's very clear in the Indian law that ideas are not protected, expressions are. So let's say if you're learning for some purpose and you're taking the non-expressive content, or you're basically extracting ideas, and you're extracting knowledge, and you're extracting information, and then you're using that to develop your own research, you are not violating copyright law. And that could be juxtaposed to how Gen AI models also operate. Similarly, I also felt that there was an opportunity to look at, in general, how Gen AI models really collect and use the data sets when you talk about tokenization, when you talk about statistical pattern recognition, and then you go to the outputs. Unfortunately, that is also missing from the report, but I'll sort of dwell onto it later in my second leg of the discussion. Very interestingly, the discussion on safe harbor, I think at the end of the report, is quite important, because I think that's an area where there's probably no research done till now in terms of the content liability, and whether what is the nature of Gen AI. Are they publishers? Are they intermediary? Are they somewhere in the middle? These are research questions which are open-ended right now. So the report touches upon it. The report also talks about antitrust very briefly, and I think that's necessary, but also there is an ongoing study by the Competition Commission of India. So hopefully once the study is out, that should inform the Indian competition discourse. And I think cybersecurity, definitely, I think an important point. Some of the recommendations which we saw, and be within core AI. We also had a discussion. We had a meeting last week in terms of the suggestion. I think a couple of points I want to just talk about. One is on the governance principles. I think one of the things which the report could have done was to bring in segmented governance principles. So you look at B2C, you look at B2B, and you look at B2G differentiatedly. I think that's something which could have been discussed in the report as well. Then, of course, I think Urvashi spoke on digital by design. I won't go over there. But the need for a coordination committee, and I think we need to be a little cautious when it comes to these interministerial committees. And I think in the past as well, we've seen on many occasions committees are formed. They go about doing certain things, and then it goes back to the nodal ministry. So a sectoral approach rather than a centralized approach is, I think, in my opinion, and in the conversations I've had with stakeholders, probably would make more sense when it comes to AI regulation. So we have to look at healthcare differently from possibly finance, right? And each sector should sort of work towards developing regulations if and when that time arises. So I'll stop here, but I would be happy to go on to the copyright debates further.
Thank you so much, Kazim, for this, as in to share what the copyright rules say, etc., and highlighting sectoral approach. And I think even if there are committees formed in ministerial, as in you need to have committees, as even Urvashi was saying, which are interdisciplinary also, as in obviously the government can form interministerial panels, etc., but when the work has to be done, you need a much more multi-stakeholder, broad-based approach. I think that's also important when these kind of discussions happen. I think there are some questions in the chat in case you want to see it, and later on during your second intervention, all of you want to kind of address them. That would be helpful. And I think perhaps I'll move on first to Vivan now. Vivan, over to you for your views.
Hi, thank you, Amrita. I think you should have had some villain or opposing party in this discussion, because it's otherwise it's like a blockchain. We're operating at consensus nodes and everyone's agreeing with each other. And that's the problem with this. I think what we have here is a discussion, because it's almost like one of TRAI's pre-consultation papers rather than a fully baked consultation paper. So as Kazim said, bunch of questions. I think we need, again, at the risk of repetition, clarity on the specific nature of multi-stakeholder involvement. It cannot be left vague and undefined. And I think actually this paper could have been 3 or 4 papers, one on just the procedural stuff, how do you set up institutional design to address some of this, and that is the most undercooked aspect of how we regulate in India in any case. We always think of institutional design questions later. The Data Protection Board is one such example, where we have no idea how cases will be adjudicated, and beyond the penalties being levied, how will we get clarity on many of the things? We have to depend on generalists in high courts to do that, and it's just a symptom of a larger problem that we don't think of institutional design carefully enough in India. And we've had 30 years of regulated sectors post-liberalization, and we've not had a serious and considered conversation on institutional design. It's unfortunate. We need to do that as a community, also speak for the multi-stakeholder community, which also I want to just correct one thing, that I'm not speaking on behalf of any consortium, because far be it from me to do that. I think every one of us needs to speak up individually or have the sanction to speak on other people's behalf. So I'm not doing that. I'm just going to be discursive in my remarks today. And these are individual remarks. And if you look at multi-stakeholderism, just to stay on that point, as it's seen through the lens of administration, such as in the US, they have, under the NIST and other areas, other institutions, they've decided to go down this socio-technical path. It's not too different from, I guess, basically just integrating the sociological questions with the engineering questions and delving into the governance challenges in that way. But they also have ways and means of operationalizing this socio-technical approach through the various standards that are in play in the US currently. So that's just one aspect, I think, and I agree with some of the co-panelists that multi-stakeholderism we give lip service to in India. It ends up being a couple of representatives who are there for good measure in every panel, and even the process for this pre-consultation paper, as I would like to call it, it exemplifies that, right? I mean, it could have perhaps gained from the community and crowdsourced much more, at the risk of becoming a full-on PhD on what this should be. Then there's this whole other dimension, which again, people have touched on whether we take a risk-based approach, or do we just identify harms to begin with so that we know what we're dealing with? Are we prioritizing hard laws versus soft laws, nodal versus sectoral? Of course, these are not binaries, but you have to start to get a sense of where the country is headed on these questions, given that we're so advanced in these conversations in some other jurisdictions, even though there's a pendulum swing between the innovators breaking out and the government sort of trying to regulate them. There is nothing on international dimensions either on the legal aspect of it. So for instance, as Kazim was talking about copyright earlier, I mean, the one thing that we should try to do as a country is ensure that whatever the regime may be, it's not it's consonant with a large majority of international jurisdictions that we do business with, that we create content for, that we source content from, that we license to and license from, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, we're going to create a real khichdi of copyright and AI, and that's not a wise thing to do, I suppose, outside of just thinking about ingestion and also the rights of people, AI created works and so on and so forth. I think, and to preface all of this, there could have been an entirely different paper on just the kinds of AI systems we're thinking about. I mean, obviously, this paper was written at a time when ChatGPT and foundational models, etc., were in vogue, and they still are. But it's not necessarily the case that the deployments in the Indian context or the diffusion of this technology in the Indian context is going to be most palpable in a sectoral sense or from a harm sense only through these kind of language models. And in fact, if you look at, for instance, the use of supercomputing infrastructure in India, this CDAC has this Airavat supercomputing platform where you and universities can access high performance computing, and they'll soon, I mean, India has intention in a similar way, right? You eventually want to provide GPU capacity to universities, startups, etc., to access. And you'll see that like 90% of the use of some of our best supercomputers is all for natural language processing. So it kind of indicates that there are certain areas where India is developing applications, Indian innovation is happening. And we have to keep a dynamic map of that. And just coming back to AI systems, autonomous systems would differ widely from generative AI or discriminative AI, and you have to learn to think about these things differently. You can't, the moment you take the point of departure is generative AI, then you have a certain very set of things that you want to discuss because they are in vogue, including like copyright or including the competition question and so on and so forth. These are just questions that we feel, I think on the basis of our derivative learning on public policy, on AI, that these are the most important. And then there's the final bucket of first principles, which again, I mean, I don't know what the basis for shortlisting the ones that we have were, but it just goes to the point of, if you don't know which AI system you're talking about, you really can't talk about first principles in a homogeneous way as if it will apply equally across the board. It's nonsensical beyond the point. And we don't have to go into AI 101 here, but suffice to say that, again, The different systems will require very different principles and points of departure. So I'll leave it at that and develop this.
Thanks so much, Vivan, for this. And I'll move to Amlan. Amlan, your initial thoughts on this guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, Amrita. Good to be here. So I'm going to try and keep this short again, going last. I do want to hear from some of the other people in the room, and maybe respond to some of the questions as well. But the way that I like to think about this is in three parts. And I'll refer to obviously what the subcommittee's report says, but also some of my views and what my research shows. The first is around capacity, that's regulatory capacity and risk assessments and classification. The second is on regulation itself. And the third is on governance, and I mean institutional governance systems. So on the first piece around capacity building, I think what's clear from the report is that the committee is in favor of a risk-based approach. And I think that makes sense. What I do worry about is how we're going to be able to come up with a risk classification framework. Because from all of my research, what I find is that there is a lack of empirical data on what the harms are in the Indian context. Right? I hear often when I'm speaking about this issue, people say we already have a risk-based classification framework in the AI Act, the EU's AI Act. And of course, you can't simply transpose what's in the EU to the Indian context. These are grounded in social, cultural contexts and realities on the ground, which unfortunately are not easily transposable from one jurisdiction to the other. So, if you are going to talk about a risk-based approach, you have to talk about what the harms are that are leading to these risks. And therefore, you need data on the ground about what these harms are. So, of course, the question is, does the report kind of address this? I don't think it does. The one potential reference it makes to this is to be able to collect evidence of risk based on an incident database. Now, think about the practicalities of this, right? You really want people to report, at scale, what the harms are, where is this going to be reported, who's going to actually collect this. So I just feel like that's, just one of many options. I wish the committee maybe would have talked about the need for, civil society, for people who work on the ground to do the field research required to collect evidence of harm, right? And that brings me to the next question, which is, it's a much more ecosystem-wide issue, which is who's going to fund this research, right? It's certainly not the people who are building all of these technologies, because I don't think it's in their interest to have a lot of data come out about the kinds of harms. Is it going to be the government? In which case, I would have hoped that the report would have mentioned this. And if it's not, if it's civil society, well, okay, again, we're currently in this climate of funding being pulled out for things that are priority socially relevant issues. I don't know that we're going to have a lot of that available, those resources available. So that's my primary concern. So while I see the reports address the broader issue of a need for a risk-based approach, I don't think it draws the relationship between risk and harm adequately enough, and it doesn't talk about the larger ecosystem requirements around funding and resources to do that hard research. I mentioned all of this in a paper I've written for Carnegie India called India's Advance on AI Regulation, and I highlight there the need for more empirical research in the Indian context. So that's point one. On point two, I think there's a broader question of regulatory capacity, which again the committee tries to answer with the need for a technical secretariat in MeitY, and that's great, and I think that can be done. But I think there's a much more important issue of what are you actually trying to build capacity around? And we really need to be thinking about, at a very technical level, this idea that you want to explain what the capabilities of AI systems are, and for people to be intuitively be able to understand, again, how that can be applied to different socially relevant problems, but also get a sense of what those risks are. And we need to be able to communicate that through workshops and case studies and so on. So I wish when it came to regulatory capacity, the committee did a little bit more to talk about what it would be talking about, what it would be communicating, what those awareness programs and literacy programs could look like, to talk about the capabilities, the opportunities, benefits, capabilities, but also the risks and downsides of AI systems. And then third, when it comes to, I think, what will inform this entire debate from a regulatory point of view or a governance point of view is this point, again, Urvashi and others have mentioned about the gaps in the existing legal framework, right? You need to strengthen this. And I understand it's beyond perhaps the remit of this particular committee to have done that comprehensive research. But again, who's going to do that, right? Somebody needs to be able to pick up a specific issue, for example, the need for more human oversight or the need for protections from a rights-based approach, right? Around enabling the user, the individual, to be able to access information or object to decision making, right? Who's going to do that review of across all of our regulations in India? What are the gaps that need to be filled, right? And this could happen in the Consumer Protection Act, it could happen in the Data Protection Act, it could happen in criminal codes and civil codes. That analysis is obviously not in this committee report, and I thought that was actually primary to be able to even have the conversation about what regulatory amendments need to happen. So I thought that was missing, but I know I'm just pointing out a lot of kind of gaps in the report, but I think that's really what we should be getting to, because I think overall, obviously, it's commendable that the government has put this out. It's a public consultative report. I think it's well structured. So just kind of trying to point out potentially areas where we as civil society can plug those holes. On the regulation piece, the way that I think about it is that it needs to be, for at least the Indian context, a combination of self-regulation and some very targeted regulatory interventions through legislative amendments or new guidelines and so on. And I heard Urvashi say earlier that she doesn't think self-regulation works, and I agree there are some limitations to self-regulation, but we have to start somewhere. And countries around the world, whether it's countries like the US, which is a very hands-off free market approach, or countries like Singapore or Japan, which are I think approaching this from a human-centric, user-centric point of view, still recognize the value of self-regulation. So I do think in India, we need to stop talking about self-regulation and actually do the work. And so I'm thinking about what that really looks like. I'm working on a paper with CRI at IIT Madras on what self-regulation for India should look like. And really, I think we should start with, across the ecosystem, what are the baseline norms we can all agree on, right? And not high-level principles, but really something that, in some ways, urges companies to adopt some technical organizational measures to actually try and achieve some of the larger objectives around transparency, around privacy, security, safety, and so on. So I do think, some form of self-regulation, and specifically, I'm thinking about potentially some voluntary commitments that the broad ecosystem can sign on to. That would, I think, be a good starting point for this discussion on regulation. And then, of course, we need to have this conversation on what those new regulatory targeted amendments should look like. And I'm doing some thinking on that right now and have some broad ideas. But again, it would have to start with what are the gaps in the law. Unless you do that analysis, there's no point, proposing amendments. So I think we need to do that in parallel. But I think we don't need to think about that necessarily as something that's going to, and this is obviously the narrative, which is that this is something that's going to stifle innovation. It's going to be hard to comply with. I think we should be thinking about regulation as actually a clarifying forcing function, right? Which is you have new regulation to be able to classify platforms so that everyone in the AI value chain knows where they stand or what their obligations are. And live questions of liability are clarified, right? So I actually think it can help promote innovation and promote business clarity and certainty. And I think that's the narrative that needs to change when it comes to new regulatory amendments. And the third and final piece that, the framework that I look at this is governance. And I think the committee does a good job about talking about a whole of government approach, which is something that I recommend as well in my paper. And I think, the way that I think about it is like a 3-step process. To start really with people who are closest to the issues at hand, both on the opportunity side and on the risk side, and that's sectoral domain regulators or agencies, right? So in the financial context, it's RBI, SEBI, Ministry of Finance. In the agricultural context, the Ministry of Agriculture. So it's really a hub and spoke model, which obviously the government, I think, is very familiar with and in favors, including in the proposed AI Safety Institute. And I do think we should extend that to AI governance, right? Really start with the domain regulators. The second level is where you have MeitY to look at, more broadly like cross-sectoral principle-based governance approaches to AI. And then I think, and this is what's missing, I think, or at least a clear recommendation on what an interministerial process looks like. I think they've suggested, the PSA is involved or set up a kind of interministerial committee process. It's not really clear to me what that process looks like, who's going to be involved. I do think that's going to be increasingly important once you understand the strategic importance of AI, right? This is not purely about, AI in a specific context. It's about AI across different sectors. It's about AI from a diplomatic context. It's AI from a opportunity context, from a economic context, from a social empowerment context. So you really need to have the right people on the table when it comes to a cross-sectoral approach. And then the final piece on governance is not just domestically. It's really we need to be thinking about global governance, right? And I saw this question in the chat, which is, and again, this is where I'm going to go a little bit, off the cuff when I make my remarks. Is what's the significance even of this report right now, right? We just saw in the safety summit this retreat on regulation, right? There's obviously a camp that's talking about deregulation. There's talking up the opportunity, and there's a small minority, in this case, not even particularly vocal, that's still talking about the importance of risks. And then you have this report, which, as lots of the panelists were characterizing, is like a pre-consultation consultation paper, right? So, again, what is India's position on all this, right? Do we want to really put our money where our mouth, walk the talk when it comes to balancing risk and innovation? Because we've done a lot on the innovation side, right? We're doing, access to compute. We're doing a lot of work around, local foundation models. What has India actually done on the risk mitigation side? And unfortunately, beyond setting up the Safety Institute, there hasn't, and providing grants to people building safety tools. I don't think a lot has actually happen on risk mitigation. So I think this is actually too less, too late. And so I really think we need to start getting into action.
Thanks a lot, Amlan, and very valid points which you had shared. And we'll go to the next section, as in, see, we look at it as guidelines, but we're really not sure where this will go, this report would go. So how do, to the panelists first, that how do you think, what is it we should recommend, would be my question to all of you. Perhaps I could go with Kazim first. Tarunima.
Just one single
Okay, go ahead.
minute, just to close the previous loop, because the sectoral and nodal thing is coming up again and again. Just again, having dealt with different regulators, when we think of whole of government, we don't necessarily need to think of them as the first point of departure, for the reason that every regulator comes with a very clear set of biases with respect to those they are regulating. So the TRAI is very heavy set on their regulated entities enjoying certain privileges, and is always always in a sort of expansionary mode when it comes to jurisdiction. The RBI is very cautious about big tech, about big data, about people with actors that fall outside their supervisory remit, and sometimes is also takes huge pendulum swings between one regime and another in terms of how they think about technology overall. You've seen that play out with fintech over the last year and a half. A lot of value has been eroded after being created, with the sanction of the RBI, in a sense. Lots of new intermediaries were born, and then those guys are born and they start, spawning their, activities and business models, and at some point the regulator feels incapacitated to deal with those, and then there's a hammer of Thor type of approach to deal with that. All of a sudden, there's a sudden stop on those kind of activities that it feels is outside its traditional supervisory remit. We've seen the CCI also, even characterized pretty clearly into a ideological mold today. Antitrust is political globally. We are no different. And we know the politics of antitrust, I think, in this room in India today. And if that is to dominate how we think about AI infrastructure, then God help us develop those models that we want to develop. So just to be clear on the whole of government approach, the role of MeitY is very important as an enabling ministry historically. It is the one that has the national policy on electronics. It is the one that has the national software products policy. It is the one that has an IT policy, which is, these are supposed to be the foundation models for defining these areas, what our vision is, what our aspirations are. These do not rest with the RBI, with the SEBI, with the IRDAI, TRAI, and so on and so forth. So as far as IT applications are concerned, and I think a lot of our discussions so far have been about IT applications. We have not discussed robotics, just to be clear. So we are indeed focusing on the app side of things, because that's where our startup energies seem to be focused, and that's where we find capabilities in our supply chains, and where all of these many of these folks in the audience and on the panel have really dedicated their own capacity building. then we need to understand that the MeitY has an important role to play there as almost like a tabula rasa or whatever for conversion of a particular idea of governance, and thinking about it through the first principles of how do we let that sector, how do we balance innovation and harm and all of that, and then kind of hand over to sectoral regulators also those principles to apply in a even-handed manner. Otherwise, you're just going to have people acting on preemptively on risks that they have not been used to dealing with, and I think that's a pretty catastrophic setup for AI development in India.
Thanks, Vivan. So what we'll do is we'll take two questions from the room or comments, and then we will go. I think I said Kazim first, and Tarunima, Urvashi, Amlan, and you, Vivan, would be the last speaker. So anyone wants to share any questions or comments, you could quickly share your, raise your hand and we'll take it. Anyone in the room wants to share any questions, comments? Anyone in the audience, as in there were a few questions, I can read them out. But if anyone has any questions. Swati, do you have the questions in front of you? Would you want to read out any of them? Or I think I have. There was a question from Arindam which says, in the context of the current recalibration being done in AI governance policies, as seen by the US government actions and also seen at the recent AI Action Summit towards making the regulations less onerous for businesses and innovation, do we envision India also following suit? Is there benefit in doing so? Is this the new benchmark being set? This is one question. And I think Archit says, Archit had a question. This is related to what Tarunima was speaking. And he says that the line between user safety and security is often blurred, and many online harms don't necessarily fall under cybercrime or cybersecurity. Wouldn't it be more effective to strengthen online harms and user safety laws like the DIA rather than including these harms in AI governance here? Additionally, do you see value in addressing platform governance, online harms, and digital well-being through data governance and other sector-specific frameworks along with the DIA? So there are a few more questions, but I'll just keep it at this. So in case, yes, Archit, you want to speak further? Over to you.
Thank you, Amrita. Sorry, I think I posted that question a while back. Just to double tap on, I think, what Amlan said, and just to sort of bind that point together, what I was really trying to get at is that it's pretty clear that the issues that we have are nothing new in terms of tech regulation that were not clear to us. From data regulation or data governance and platform governance standpoint, these issues about harms have been pretty clear to us. The first principles are pretty clear to us. There are enough global frameworks. We agree on what kind of risks that a AI governance framework should address. And there is, of course, the Chinese and American and the Chinese, American, and the European case study of the digital empires that I think Amlan also referred to. There is enough for us to learn. What I was trying to really get at is the fact that when we know these tools are available to us, we know that data trusts can help us sort of curb monopolies, and we shouldn't let a AI monopoly get created, for instance. Why can't we use these existing tools and research to sort of further that point? And secondly, just to come back to what Amlan had said about research not being funded, I think that seems to be one of the core bases on what we really should consider harms as, which are unique to South Asia, which are unique to Indian subcontinent. I think those kind of research projects are not funded, or at least not independently funded. I think that's really what my comment I want to center around, that if there are enough independent research projects that are funded through independent organizations, that is really where would help us in narrowing down what online harms we are trying to regulate here. Thank you.
Thanks, Archit. And I guess, does anyone from the speakers want to address it, or should we go with Kazim first and then move around? Or Amlan, if you want to come in.
Yeah, and completely agree, Archit. And I think what I'll just tweak maybe what the subcommittee calls a whole of government approach. I think we need to, at least in the Indian context, think of as a whole of ecosystem approach, right? Which is that a lot of what's going to inform the governance debate in India is not going to come from the government. I was in a meeting with the secretary in the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, the Consumer Affairs Secretary, and they want this information. They want to know what the harms are in a very real sense. They want, case studies, empirical evidence, and the government doesn't have the resources to do this, right? And understandably so, they have a lot of competing priorities. So we need to take it up within the ecosystem for someone to be able to fund this research, for someone to do this research, and then present this research. So I really think it's not just a whole of government approach, it's a whole of ecosystem approach that's going to inform the governance debate in India.
Thanks, Amlan. So Kazim, over to you. You have 3.5 minutes. All of you have 3.5 minutes. I was just looking at the time. We will then, since the time is till 5:30, we may have to extend, but if you can.
So I think, Amrita, the point is, what are we trying to achieve from regulation, right? I mean, if you're regulating to prevent harm, I think you need to first assess whether your existing laws do a good enough job. Just because there is a new technology which is catching the eye of the world and there are summits happening globally, you don't need to rush to regulate something which can be dealt with through existing laws. Wherever you need to regulate something or you need to sort of introduce a new intersectionality, you need to study that first. And I think it's really important that the government, and this report does a good job of bringing out those issues. I think one of the things which co-panelists also mentioned was international relations, and I think it misses out on the geopolitics. And I think that's something very important. Obviously, the report was drafted before the export controls rules were initiated by the government of US. But I think you need to understand, okay, on one hand, we want to build our own LLMs. We want to compete with DeepSeek. But then under copyright laws, we are assuming that LLMs are infringing, right? So there is a clear conflict of opinions between these two things, right? If you need to build LLMs, you need access to data sets. Where will you get the data sets from? You need to be able to train your data sets from, whatever is out there on the internet, right? So that's number one. I think number two is, while it does a good job of different areas, I think we need to spend some couple of more years in doing research to understand what are the new areas of regulation. So definitely liability and AI is an area where there's got to be research in terms of understanding between the AI lifecycle approach, which the report really talks about well, who is liable at what stage, right? I think that's something which requires an institution or a series of, or a lot of institutions to be set up. There's got to be a lot of funding for such research, which should inform future regulation. On competition, I believe the CCI is doing something, but I also think that there needs to be a debate in terms of what are the existing harms, what are the existing market concentration taking place, and whether do we have evidence to really go and say, okay, we got to regulate AI from a competition lens. We've seen in the DCV debates that there was very limited evidence in terms of the impact. And you saw the startups ecosystem sort of talking about that, okay, it could impact us as well. So do we need this law or not? We got to be very careful in terms of suggesting new modes or new branches of regulation without having done the research. And the third point is on copyright, right? I mean, that's something which it struck out for me because it's based on pure assumptions. Having previously said, I think there are things which GenAI does, which falls outside the copyright law, including whenever it sort of produces content which is not similar in nature, which is not adaptive in nature, then it's not violating copyright. The report sort of assumes that, okay, by default, there is copyright infringement taking place. Therefore, what should we do in terms of regulation? But the legal analysis says something else. And I think a couple of points over here is, one, if a GenAI tool, let's suppose, is transforming the work or transforming from the original content on which it has been trained on, then there is no violation. Similarly, if it's creating different outputs which do not match the input or the data sets which it has been trained on, there is no protection for ideas. Of course, expressions are protected. So if a Gen AI tool is for the purpose, it's being developed for the purpose of expressive use, then there is an infringement. And there could be use cases to discuss those, or what could be those expressive forms which we can look into. Similarly, extractive use needs to be protected. And I think we are in the journey of our ODI ecosystem that we need to help Indian startups to be able to access data sets. And the big companies have deep pockets. They can go and license publishers across the globe, and they'll be able to pay for it. But what happens if we have to build affordable models? You can't be paying for licensing with every publisher. Having said that, there are rights of publishers which have to be discussed as well. There are point of views as well which we have to cater to with respect to. Obviously, there's a discussion going on globally in terms of fair compensation. I think that's a debate which possibly could take place going forward. Infringement of any form should not happen, and I think the models have developed over a period of 2 years, where they have reduced the output of verbatim content. But I think there needs to be more guardrails, and some of those guardrails are mechanisms to prevent direct regurgitation of training data, or processes which ensure substantial transformation of outputs, functions that generate outputs serving distinct purposes. So you have to put guardrails to make sure that the output stage of a Gen AI does not violate the law. Now, there's a debate which takes place, which is also taking place, is whether traditional copyright laws are enough, and whether you need new laws. I think so. That's also a new debate which is taking place globally. But definitely, I think, speaking from a point of view, if you're looking at a regulatory policy point of view right now, models, what they're doing, if they are placing those right guardrails in terms of infringement, you cannot just go and say, okay, just because a model is trained on a lot of copyrighted data, it is violating copyright law. No, it's not violating copyright law. And that's a regulatory position. For a policy position to take place, I think as an economy, if we are investing in LLMs, we also need to give some sort of a runaway to the startups to be able to develop and train data sets on. But I think these questions will obviously evolve with the court case going on. There's a lot of jurisprudence which will be developed over the next 5 years on these areas of intersection. And
We'll
similarly,
have to
for the
stop
last
you,
point,
Kazim.
just last point on the safe harbor point. I think that's also also a research which needs to happen, and I think if MeitY probably would like to do that in terms of having more consultations, in terms of figuring out, okay, how do we look at the liability when it comes to content being produced, and whether we should give safe harbor or not. I think that's a good question to ask, but you need a more robust process to answer these questions. I hope the submissions help in us getting somewhere, but let's see how it goes.
Thanks, Kazim. Sorry to stop you. Incidentally, it's Kazim's birthday today, but he's spending time with us. I think, one of the asks perhaps from CCAOI we would be doing is this should be a starting point of conversations for more stakeholder consultations, because there is more to discuss in this particular topic before anything is drafted. And with that, perhaps I'll go over to Tarunima.
Yes. Thank you. Happy birthday, Kazim. Yeah, I'll try and capture maybe my responses to a bunch of the questions, but in 3 broad points, which are linked together. So it's kind of uncontroversial to say whole of ecosystem, right? Like it's one of the easiest, and like how do you even attack that idea? Of course, it should be a whole of ecosystem approach, as it should be with any sector, I think. And I think, but specifically on the issue of self-regulation, even when I was reading the subcommittee report, I'm trying to pull out the specific lines where it said that the players should be able to regulate each other. And what I read of that is that you should have startups that are, so for example, doing auditing and sort of like cybersecurity attacks to probe vulnerabilities in other applications. And I think I'm not even sure our cultural and legal environment allows for that, right? So for example, we've seen cases where, say, students in universities have gone and built apps over IRCTC, right? And then they go and get arrested for whatever reason. I mean, that's a specific case, but I do think that there's a certain culture of investigation that is not not only is it not encouraged, I think it's just something that's very quickly clamped down upon. And then I think you have to be very careful about the realities of the big players having all sorts of ways of coming down on maybe some of the more under the cover players who, or the sort of smaller ones who might not have the same political clout, might not have the same economic might. So I do think this, beyond this idea of you should self-regulate and we should be investigating each other, I think there's a broader conversation of how do you encourage that to happen, because my sense is the current environment is not conducive to it. And a lot of my perspectives come from, for example, maybe from the technical standpoint of actually having to do some of this safety probing online harms, or from a technical standpoint having to do some of this work. And I will say that it's difficult. There's ambiguity around scraping in India, there's ambiguity around investigating systems, when is it a cybersecurity violation, etc. So I think having some clarity on those boundaries will also help to promote this idea of self-regulation and investigation. I think something that has come in, I'm not in agreement with this. Maybe I misunderstood it. I don't think the harms of AI systems are clear to us. At a high level, sure. In the same way that at that high level, the principles are fairly uncontroversial. I think at a high level, you can name the harms, but in the specifics, you don't know how this manifests. When, say, 4 years, I guess maybe even 5 years back, when we were looking at the incorporation of algorithmic decision-making systems in, say, finance, right? There were issues of explainability on in which applications do we care about explainability, in which applications do we not. What has happened more recently with the rise of Gen AI, and just because of the force and the narrative that is getting pushed towards us, is that we all have to believe that, okay, this is something very powerful, and these are still very much probabilistic systems that don't have explainability, right? But all of us are using them in different domains. The government and you have philanthropies who are pushing to see how you can use some of these systems in different domains. And I think in some ways, perhaps some of our norms of what is acceptable are shifting because of what the force of this technology, right? So to me, it feels like just in terms from our work, for example, I mean, very concretely, can you get LLMs to tell you how to, for example, create acid attacks, right? I mean, I think, and similarly, what happens when you mix punctuations in different languages and you land up jailbreaking models. So again, I think at the high level, all of these harms, sure, you can categorize them into some categories that we already recognize, but I think in the specifics, we don't know, and the techniques for jailbreaking, breaking these models continue to emerge. In India, in particular, India's put so much thrust on voice models, right? So while the West cares a lot about text-based LLMs, we have pushed so much into voice-based models. And I think there is almost, no one knows how to yet, how do you actually do any kind of auditing on those? So I think even in terms of our own industry priorities, I think we need to think about safety very, very clearly. And then I think finally, I would say that on the regulation front, I think I have always been a little ambivalent because, again, in part, you don't know what you're regulating. In part, it's kind of like saying that you enforce traceability, but people go figure out how do you make something traceable, right? I don't think that's a well sort of grounded way of approaching an environment like a ecosystem like AI, because we are not trying to kill this. We want to foster innovation, right? So to me, it feels like when I was reading Techno Legal, what I read in it was that, okay, every time you think of a regulation, find the technical ways of also making it happen, which I think is necessary. I completely, I mean, if that's the orientation of Techno Legal, I think that is something that I put my full weight behind. And I think just finally, this, again, the AI Action Summit framed, it's almost like the US framed AI safety and AI regulation as one bucket that is antithetical to AI innovation. I would say that to me, AI safety and AI innovation absolutely coexist. With AI regulation, it's all in the specifics, and to me, it feels too early to even opine on whether AI regulation is or is not antithetical to AI innovation. I think it really will come down to the specifics. AI safety, definitely, working and investing on it from the research standpoint, etc., is absolutely in line with AI innovation.
Thanks so much, Arunima. And just for the speakers, if you could stay some 10 minutes or 15 minutes extra, because we may be running out of time. And I think it would be Urvashi next, and then Amlan, and then Vivan.
So I'll be brief. I mean, just echoing, I think what Tarunima was saying also, we don't really have evidence of harms, right? And the kind of concrete, what Amlan was saying as well. And I think if there's any funders on this call, there's at least 6 organizations here which can to build that evidence on those harms and would be very, very happy to do so. But it is really a gap, right? Like, I mean, we can talk about governance and regulation all we want, but till we actually do that empirical, we build that empirical evidence on what is really going on the ground, which is kind of, shooting darts in the air in some sense. And so that whole ecosystem approach has to also involve the research ecosystem. And even from an innovation perspective, if you look at, how the so-called superpowers in this space, whether it's the US or China, actually became these superpowers, they didn't do it on the back of building products, right? They did it on the back of kind of building kind of ecosystems. So our imagination of kind of product first, use case first, and that's how we kind of win the AI race, I think is quite a myopic imagination. And then just linking, and then going from there maybe to the question around the AI summit and what we saw in terms of how countries were approaching it. I mean, I think it was a real defeat for a lot of the civil society work that has been done around kind of centering issues of justice and centering issues of rights in the AI discourse. We took many steps back, and I think it was quite worrying to actually see that if you look very closely at what the American new vice president was saying and what the European commissioner was saying, the difference was actually not of kind anymore. It was actually a difference of degree. Well, earlier there had been a difference of kind. So I think we are seeing countries move towards more kind of deregulation of AI. Even President Macron, despite the focus on this kind of being public interest AI, the kind of statements that he made and the investments that they promised pushed in a very different direction. And I think that's something for us to be concerned about. I don't think that's necessarily the right approach. I think there is, of course, a huge risk and a likelihood that other countries will follow that beat. Because it does legitimize that kind of approach, but I think it would be a concerning kind of approach. And I think part of the problem there is that, the way public interest AI is being framed, or the idea of AI in the public interest is framed currently, is just that if you have access to more compute, access to more data, access to more R&D, that's equal to public interest AI. But I don't think that's actually centers the question enough of what is in the public interest. What kind of AI is in the public interest? And I think that's the kind of question we need an ecosystem approach to really try and answer, and where our focus should be. But, the likelihood of that happening, or the incentives for that happening, are obviously are quite weak. And then just finally, a point around kind of voluntary commitments, and picking up something that Amlan said, like, definitely we need to start somewhere. And I think some things require voluntary commitments, and I think some things require kind of top-down commitments, and it has to be a kind of mixed approach. What I think is really interesting and unique about India's role is actually, or India's position, is the role that the government is actively playing in shaping the market, or at least the posturing it is doing towards shaping the market for responsible AI. And it has an opportunity there, right, to actually create good market standards, to set the benchmark for what responsible innovation would look like. Unfortunately, right now it's being done in a very piecemeal manner by like hackathons and challenges to launch foundation models in 6 months and those kind of things. But if one really drills down and tries to develop that strategy, I think that's where India's kind of unique positionality or competitive advantage in this space lies. The government can play an active market shaping role. And part of that is also kind of governing by setting by exemplar. So some of the principles that we see in the report, whether it's around transparency or accountability, those are not being followed through by government agencies themselves, who are in many ways some of the largest procurer of AI systems, if you compare to many other geographies. So that leading by example, it would be a really important messaging, posturing, and then translated to something concrete as like procurement, etc., there's a lot of scope there to actually make something like voluntary commitments a good thing to do. But if you don't kind of lead by example, then something like voluntary commitments is likely not to deliver on its promise, and will just remain a kind of paper tiger. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Urvashi. I think you walking the talk, as you mentioned, is important, as well as, I think one of the challenges in many, not only in the AI, not only in this sphere, in most of it is the implementation part, or, even ensuring that the rules which are there are adhered, or, bringing in new regulations, etc., is always fancy, but are existing regulations used, or I would say implemented well, or enforced well? I would say enforcement would be the word. And with that, perhaps I'll go to Amlan. Amlan, you were speaking about, a bit of voluntary commitment or self-regulation, as well as targeted regulation. There I would also add, in the targeted regulation, do you think certain existing regulations can be tweaked before we even envisage bringing in newer set of regulations, which seems to be something everyone likes to talk about always?
Yeah, Amrita, now you've just put another kind of bone for me to chew on, which is on the enforcement piece. And on that, maybe let's just start with that, right? Which is, you're going to have a new set of regulations, but what's the point? Or you update your regulations, but what's the point if existing rules are not being enforced, right? And I hear this all the time, which is, if I in some way have dealt with or been the victim of some harm caused by an AI system today, what do I do about it? Right? Do I go to the Consumer Protection Authority? Do I file a writ petition? Do I go to MeitY? Is MeitY a regulator? I think these are questions, if you really think from a consumer perspective, you're going to draw a lot of blanks, right? So I think the point is not, do we need a new regulator for AI? The point is the existing regulatory enforcement mechanism for the digital economy working, right? And I speak to a lot of people who, on both sides, right, on the government side and the private industry side, feel like perhaps we need to start thinking about a regulator for the digital economy that actually works, not this ad hoc system of an adjudicating office under the IT Act, which is actually the secretary, which is actually the IT secretary, which we all know has no time to be able to deal with these disputes. So that's just the point on enforcement. But maybe just to end, right? I'd like to just piggyback on what Urvashi said, because I think it's really insightful, right? Points on what the larger global conversation is, where things are moving, and what the opportunity is for India. And I think India has shown that obviously it wants to be a champion for the global South. And there's a huge, I think, impetus for us to leverage that AI opportunity, right, for socio-economic transformation. And I think we're doing that. I think the Indian government is really putting all of its money, all of its resources, all of its time into that. And, you have the compute piece, you have, infrastructure development, you have local models, skilling, all of that. Can India be also a leading voice and an example on the governance front is the question I'll leave for this room, because India is going to lead this summit. And I think it's worth thinking about what would that look like, 6 or 8 months from now when India hosts that summit. It's not going to be called a safety summit, let's be clear. But even so, they're going to have to address questions of safety. So what role does India play in trying to bring together LATAM, in trying to bring together Africa, in trying to bring other developing nations to the table and really hear what they're thinking? And have we, even as Indian kind of civil society, pay close attention to what's happening in these countries, right? Why does Brazil actually think a more rights-based approach makes sense, right? What's so unique about it? Because we compare ourselves to Brazil when it's convenient, right? Large population, developing, but Brazil has a regulatory kind of approach, which is very different from the free market's hands-off approach. Why is that? So I think it's really, an important juncture for us, as Indians, to really think about how India can be also a leading voice on the governance front. And I'll just leave it with that kind of statement I said, which is what the Prime Minister said at the summit. India is all about balancing innovation and risk mitigation, right? We seem to be doing a lot on the innovation front. What have we done and what can we do more on the risk mitigation front is the question I'll ask.
Thanks so much, Amlan. As in, yes, having a digital regulator is good, but the concern is the challenge is we need to have something, but how will that turn out, that new beast turn out, I would say. Because if I'm looking as a consumer, if I'm affected by some harm, I am not looking at it as, is it an AI related harm? Is it something related? It is a harm to me, right, which needs to be mitigated. So, when we are talking about even having the use cases of, is it AI related harm, or it's, what is the harm, what is the risk? Many times, as a user, as a consumer, we may not be able to differentiate. This was done by it. Yesterday, I was in the call, which was of the audit on the setting up of the new, they were having a consultation, and then there was a group which had come in, and they are a group which talks about AI related harm, and they're collecting case studies across, and obviously it's from Global West. We don't have that kind of a, I would say, body who's looking at it, because I guess they have more, they have collected more information on that. We do not. Perhaps those are certain things we may want to look at, to bring in those kind, and that's a civil society organization, perhaps looking at people who can collect these cases, because it's not easy to differentiate between an AI-based, harm vis-a-vis some other technology-related harm. But I guess these are complex things. We'll come to it sometime. Vivan, over to you.
Yeah, just going to rattle off a bunch of seemingly unconnected things, starting with what you said. I think this question of dealing with harms, we think about it again narrowly in the context of apps. It will involve trade-offs in how we think about the development of the legal regulatory architecture. Even something as simple as data protection, we'll need to rethink the way we're thinking about the rules now. If we want companies to have better regulatory technologies and supervisory technologies deployed to prevent frauds, scams, spam, which plague us all. And I think that's a discernible harm that we are all, subject to every day. So there are lots of these kind of intersectional conversations on how do we actually enable companies to play a part in this stuff, and that may require rewiring of legal frameworks. And data minimization as a principle may not work for that, unfortunately. And so we have to, we have to have a nuanced conversation on how we deal with harms, and not necessarily a derivative one. On governance, I feel sorry for the multiple segments of digital economy that now are so ignored because we've gone through successive waves of obsession with whatever is new. So I remember when I walked into this field, everyone was obsessed with freedom of expression and safe harbor. It's come back, of course, full circle. But and then we had this like 8-year cycle of discussions around privacy, and now everyone's fatigued, and the privacy evangelists also are sort of have had kids and moved on. Then there's been this whole antitrust wave, which we're still sort of like still washing upon our shores. And then now we see AI governance as a wave where we've left a lot of these segments behind. We have not resolved these conversations. What are we talking about self-regulation when we don't have still a self-regulatory structure under the IT Act, despite having put one, contours of it in place in 2023 for, say, gaming? What about, how we proceed on fintech self-regulation? Are we doing a good job of impaneling new agencies? We have one that is impaneled with the RBI now for digital lending largely, but which are the other regulators and ministries thinking about self-regulation or sectorally or horizontally? Has anyone even come up with a template outside of the RBI, which, like I said, is moving very slowly, dragging its feet on impaneling more and more SROs, for instance? So there's a lot of legacy conversations that get left behind in this stuff. And I just hope that, we don't repurpose capacities to deal with this question and leave some of the fundamental stuff behind. We have and user safety is fundamental, but it's not all about how we just look at AI regulation. It is about how we look at tech and criminal liability and various other things that people have brought up. On the question of liability, and Archit, I'm sorry, you brought it up, this question of conflict of interest and who's funded, how they're funded. Archit, we have to, at least as this community, we have to leave those notions behind and let ideas fight each other in the marketplace. every research is funded, everyone comes with some sort of a bias into signing a check. Nobody gives money to any other person without that bias. I can assure you, even if the regulators saying that, okay, XYZ agency will do a market study for me, they will have a certain notion of where that should proceed, where that should go, and so on and so forth. So you should really test the strength of our independent research on the basis of the ideas that are put forth, and whether you will be able to easily characterize them as being motivated by special interests, or whether they can stand on their own. And I think, at least as a civil society, a multi-stakeholder community, whatever you want to call it, resources matter. And unfortunately, Archit, unless you are creating a multi-billion-dollar resource pool for all of us, we'll have to draw on resources from all spheres, and all of it, barring none, including international organizations that seemingly represent multilateral interests, are biased. And there is that bias is cooked into the design stage of creating a line item for the grant that is then given for research, or the sponsorship that is given for the research, because there is someone like you or me who's justifying the reason for that, and what design principle they want the research to follow, and so on and so forth. So it's up to us to create enough ideas that they war with each other. And just on the liability thing, Archit, there is a piece of research that the consortium that Amrita talked about has already put out, which is a collaborative piece of research on AI liability, on thinking about liability across 4 or 5 different types of AI systems, which I encourage you to see on AI-knowledge-consortium.com. Go to the publication section, download that. There'll be more to come on liability. So there are some steps that, of course, we're trying to take on that front as a community. I think we talked somewhat, access to data came up, and I just want to bring it back to DeepSeek, since it started the conversation in 2025. We really need to think about access to talent seriously in India. DeepSeek, for instance, the average employee contract is somewhere close to $300,000. Have you thought about which startup in India is going to get entry-level scientists at $300,000, and actually incentivize the kind of research innovation jobs that is needed to create something new? And forget that. I mean, in the public sector, how do we incentivize science and technology research is, of course, an open question. Our scientists are retiring with, $150,000 in their per month in their sort of retirement pensions. Is that what they are sort of, working towards at the end of 30-year careers? How do we reward them for being here? How do we reverse this brain drain, which is already in, it's happening, like the HNI drain? Over the last 3 years, we've lost a lot of AI scientists who prefer to sort of work where they're incentivized and happy and prosperous, and so on and so forth. And not all of that can be, just rebalanced through this appeal to national interest or whatever it is, because everyone wants to lead a certain quality of life, particularly those of us who are outside of Delhi in this conversation, who are already enjoying that. But just to round it off on the recommendations very quickly, the whole of government committee, even if one assumes all of this conversation is baked into some of our responses, I would encourage some of you to write in to make the government think about what happens to state level inputs, what happens to multi-stakeholderism as well. Of course, we are a quasi-federal structure. How do we draw in inputs from the ground? On the technical secretariat, I mean, which is the evidence of a technical secretariat having worked well? It's certainly not the NITI Aayog, because the problem that happens is that you are dealing with secretaries in the government of India across ministries who may not be very forthcoming in dealing with one secretary or additional secretary who's sort of drawing his powers and giving them onto the technical secretariat. So how do you actually, whip everyone together and to giving inputs in time and to actually being participative and so on and so forth? That's a design question for government, but something worth thinking about. On the incident database, which is the third recommendation, a lot of overlaps with existing incident databases. CERT has one, sectoral regulators have. So why are we creating this? What models should we look at? What about trusted flaggers outside of private sector? Some of the questions we should think about. Industry standards, self-regulation of industry or whatever, we should certainly think through. And actually in this, India has not been a laggard. India's been doing some good work at the international standard setting organization level through BIS on thinking through largely, how we convert the 2701 series into meaningful interventions in AI. And the US has basically taken the approach on this and there's a lot to be done on cybersecurity, which we've not talked about, but the US has thought about extending its sort of secure software development framework into the realm of AI, just developing that further, because cybersecurity is actually at the core of a lot of the things that we're concerned with in the realm of AI. So my point is on industry commitments, how can we kind of reflect on existing standards, ISO, BIS, NIST, many others, and map some of the commitments against, not necessarily not getting audited against those standards, but it's certainly at the thresholds they prescribe. And recommendations 5 and 6 are extremely thin on details, so I don't know what to say there, except that, for safe harbor, we don't necessarily need to think about the Communications Decency Act as the starting point and then think through what's happened and eBay and all of this. When we talk about safe harbor for these kind of new emerging categories of technology and product, we maybe should think afresh and not think in the realm of pipes and originator and progenitor and user and what is the role, etc. We probably need to think about a different kind of generation of safe harbor laws, which do give certain protections to developers and deployers alike. Yeah, I'd leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivan, for this. Final question to anyone. Do you have any questions in the audience? I think most of the questions has been answered, and final words, if speakers want to cross anyone or say anything additional in 1 minute, I could give you that time since we are already over time. Anyone has any extra points to add?
Just double down on what Urvashi said about the public sector. Let's have a voluntary code for the public sector deployments of AI first. Let's all ask for that.
We could definitely put it on at least put it in the paper, which we would do. So I guess there's a lot, if you've heard the conversations, there's a lot to be discussed, as in this is just scratching, at the surface. In case anyone has any points to add, and you think you have missed it, you could send it to us at info@ccoi.in, preferably by this week. We have Shraddhanjali and Vaishali would be making the reports, and we would first circulate it to our our speakers just to check in case everything is correct or not, and then we will be circulating it to the community. And with that, I would say thank you very much for participating, and to the speakers for spending so much of extra time with us, sharing your views. I hope these guidelines are just the starting point of the conversation, and they have more, I would say, stakeholder discussions in a real sense also, so that more inputs can be given, and at least the framing, shaping can be done in a better way. Rather than ticking the box, we have something which, at least really, as at a foundational level, has something which others could also look, because as Amlan was mentioning, many of the developing countries do look at India, as in they do ask, what is India doing? How is it doing? Our neighbors, though we don't have that friendly relations these days, they actually look at what our regulations look at. And sometimes it is also copy pasted. The Pacific Islands, for example, look at it. The African nations look at it. So I think it is necessary, if we want to champion the global South, we also get things right. Yeah, with that, I think we'll end today's discussion. Thank you so much for being here. And yes, let's hope we see some positive developments and not knee-jerk reactions. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amrita.